February 26, 1991, 4:18 p.m. local time. Captain H.R. McMaster sat in the turret of his M1A1 Abrams tank, callsign Eagle 66, as a howling Shamil sandstorm reduced the Iraqi desert to a wall of beige chaos. Visibility was perhaps 50 meters on foot. From the tank, you couldn't see your own hand if you held it beyond the commander's hatch. The wind screamed across the open turret, carrying sand that found its way into every crevice, every piece of equipment. McMaster commanded Eagle Troop 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and they were probing east into what intelligence suggested was empty desert. The GPS, still a novelty in 1991, placed them approaching a north-south grid line designated as 73 Easting on their maps. Behind Eagle Troop, the entire 7 Corps, 142,000 soldiers and 1,500 tanks, was executing the largest armored sweep since World War II. In his thermal sight, McMaster watched the desert glow in shades of white and black. The storm didn't exist in that screen. Through the swirling sand that blinded every human eye for miles, the thermal imager rendered the landscape in perfect, ghostly clarity. He saw terrain features, he saw temperature variations. He saw nothing alive. What McMaster could not yet see, what nobody in 7 Corps yet understood, was that Eagle Troop was seconds from colliding with the Tawakalna Mechanized Division of the Iraqi Republican Guard, a full division, in defensive positions. With approximately 150 T-72 tanks, the same tanks Soviet analysts had spent the previous decade assuring Moscow were more than a match for the American M1, the Iraqis, dug into defensive berms and revetments, were confident in the storm. Their active infrared night vision systems were useless. The infrared light simply scattered off the dense curtain of sand. They were blind, yes, but so was everyone else. Or so they believed. They sat and waited for the storm to pass. They laughed at those who would try to fight in this. Then McMaster's gunner, Staff Sergeant Craig Koch, spoke into the intercom, his voice level and professional. Identified. Tank. BMP. Another tank. The thermal sight had found them. T-72s. At 2,400 meters. Dozens of them. Glowing white rectangles in perfect detail through a sandstorm that rendered them completely invisible to human eyes. The Iraqis never saw Eagle Troop coming. They never heard the high-pitched whine of the AGT, 1500 turbine engines over the roar of the storm. They never had a chance to return fire at an enemy they couldn't detect. What happened next would last 23 minutes. When it ended, the entire Iraqi armored battalion, approximately 90 vehicles including tanks, armored personnel carriers, and trucks, would be destroyed. Not one American vehicle would be lost to enemy fire. The mystery that would haunt Soviet and Russian military analysts for the next 3 decades began in that storm. How had a tank they dismissed as an overweight, over-engineered, fuel-guzzling showpiece become the most lethal armored vehicle in history? How had their confident predictions proven so catastrophically wrong? The answer lay not in the moment of battle, but in the years of laughter that preceded it. To understand the magnitude of the miscalculation, you must understand the Soviet confidence that preceded it. This was not arrogance born of ignorance. It was confidence built on decades of real achievement, hard-won experience, and a design philosophy that had literally saved the world from fascism. In 1978, when detailed intelligence on the American XM-1 program first reached Moscow, the Soviet Union was the world's second superpower. Its tank forces were the largest and, by many measures, the most experienced on Earth. Soviet armor doctrine had been refined through the crucible of the Eastern Front, where thousands of tanks had clashed in battles of annihilation. The lessons learned at Kursk, at the destruction of Army Group Center, at the drive to Berlin, these were written in the blood of millions and forged into doctrine that seemed unassailable. The T-72, introduced in 1973, represented the pinnacle of this doctrine. It was not the most advanced Soviet tank. That honor belonged to the T-64 and later the T-80, but it was the most important. The T-72 was designed for mass production. Soviet factories could build them by the thousands. Tank armies could deploy them by the regiment, by the division, by the army group. The specifications told a compelling story. The T-72 was small, barely 2.2 meters tall, presenting a target profile that made NATO tankers envious. It weighed 41 metric tons, light enough to cross bridges and soft terrain that would bog down heavier vehicles. Its autoloader, a carousel mechanism that stored 22 rounds in the hull, eliminated the need for a fourth crewman. This made the tank cheaper, lighter, and faster to produce. Most importantly, it mounted a powerful 125mm 2A46 smoothbore gun that could fire armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds capable of penetrating NATO armor at combat ranges. Zaloga T-72 Main Battle Tank, 1974–93. By contrast, NATO's tanks in the late 1970s were aging. The American M60 Patton was a 1960s design. The British Chieftain was powerful but mechanically unreliable. The German Leopard 1 was fast but lightly armored. Against these opponents, the T-72 was formidable. Soviet doctrine was built for overwhelming offense. The concept was called deep operations, refined from the interwar theorist Mikhail Tukhachevsky and proven in the Manchurian campaign against Japan in 1945. The plan for war in Central Europe called for massed tank armies to punch through NATO's forward defenses at selected weak points, then drive deep into the rear, bypassing strong points, overrunning supply bases, command posts, and airfields. The goal was systemic collapse within 48 to 72 hours, before NATO's superiority in air power and before American reinforcements could arrive across the Atlantic. This doctrine required specific qualities in a tank: reliability, simplicity, speed, and above all, numbers. A tank war was a war of attrition. You needed thousands of them, and you needed conscript crews to operate them with minimal training. The T-72 delivered on all counts. When the GRU Soviet military intelligence began receiving reports on the American XM-1 program in 1977 and 1978, they analyzed it through this lens. And what they saw seemed to confirm everything they believed about the decadence and impracticality of Western military thinking. The American tank was enormous, projected at 60 tons, nearly 50% heavier than a T-72. It used a gas turbine engine, the Honeywell AGT-1500, borrowed from helicopter technology. This engine consumed fuel at an extraordinary rate. Early reports suggested fuel consumption as high as 1.5 to 3 gallons per mile depending on terrain and speed, roughly triple that of the diesel-powered T-72, Zaloga Armored Thunderbolt, the U.S. Army Sherman in World War II. The implications seemed obvious. In Soviet war games, their tank columns advanced 100 kilometers per day. An M1 Abrams, needing to refuel 3 times as often, would require a logistical tail that would slow the entire American force to a crawl. In a mobile war, the only war the Soviets planned to fight, this was a death sentence. Then there was the complexity. The M1 featured a computerized fire control system, laser rangefinders, and most mysteriously, a thermal imaging sight. Soviet night fighting relied on active infrared, essentially an invisible flashlight that illuminated the battlefield for those with IR viewers. The American system was described as passive, requiring no illumination, but Soviet analysts were skeptical. Their own attempts at thermal imaging had proven expensive, fragile, and unreliable. The Soviet conclusion, filed in reports throughout 1978 and 1979, was that the Americans were building a defensive weapon, a tank designed to sit in prepared positions, ideally on the ridgelines of southern Germany, and engage Soviet armor from long range. It might be effective in that narrow role, but it would never survive a real war. It would never survive their war. This confidence extended to the highest levels. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff from 1977 to 1984, reportedly expressed satisfaction that the Americans were wasting resources on the XM-1 when they should be investing in anti-tank helicopters and precision-guided munitions, the weapons that actually concerned him: Zaloga, red thrust, attack on the Central Front, Soviet tactics and capabilities in the 1990s. The stakes of this miscalculation could not have been higher. NATO's entire strategy for defending Western Europe, codified in the 1980s as Follow-on Forces Attack, FOFA, depended on being able to stop or at least slow Soviet armored thrusts long enough for air power and reserves to turn the tide. If the M1 Abrams failed in its role as the primary platform for this defense, there was no plan B. Western Europe would be overrun in days. But the Soviets weren't worried. Their calculations, based on decades of experience and mountains of intelligence data, told them the T-72 was superior in the metrics that mattered: numbers, reliability, and operational mobility. The American tank was a science project. The Soviet tank was a weapon of war. They had no way of knowing they had misunderstood the very nature of the conflict to come. The path to the M1 Abrams began not with American innovation, but with American humiliation. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupted in the Middle East, and within days, the assumptions underpinning Western tank design lay in smoking ruins in the Sinai Desert. Egyptian forces, equipped with Soviet AT-3 Sagar anti-tank guided missiles, destroyed Israeli tanks at an alarming rate. In the opening days of the war, Israeli armored forces, considered among the best in the world, lost approximately 400 tanks. Many were destroyed by infantry firing wire-guided missiles from well-concealed positions. Dupuy, Elusive Victory, The Arab-Israeli Wars, 1947-1974. These missiles, which cost a few $1,000s, were killing tanks that cost hundreds of thousands. The American M60 Patton tank, which formed the backbone of both Israeli and U.S. armored forces, proved vulnerable. Its armor, designed to defeat World War II-era projectiles, could not stop modern-shaped charge warheads. Its 105mm gun, while accurate, lacked the penetration to reliably defeat the newest Soviet armor at long range. Most critically, its crew was exposed to catastrophic ammunition fires when penetrated, a weakness called catastrophic kill. The lessons were stark. The next generation of tanks would face an unprecedented threat: environment. Not just enemy tanks, but masses of infantry equipped with sophisticated anti-tank missiles, artillery firing precision munitions, and attack helicopters. To survive this environment, a tank needed more than a bigger gun and thicker armor. It needed a fundamental reconception of what a tank was. The U.S. Army's answer was the MBT-70 program, a joint American-German project begun in the 1960s. The MBT-70 was to be a technological marvel, a 152mm gun that could fire both conventional shells and guided missiles, an advanced autoloader, adjustable suspension, and a host of cutting-edge systems. It was also a catastrophe. The program was plagued by cost overruns, technical failures, and disagreements between American and German requirements. By 1969, costs had spiraled to over $1 million per tank, roughly $7 million in 2024 dollars, for a vehicle that didn't reliably work. Congress killed the program in 1971. Hunnicutt Abrams, A History of the American Main Battle Tank. This failure put the U.S. Army in a desperate position. The Soviet Union was fielding thousands of T-62s and the new T-72. The M60 was increasingly obsolete. NATO had no answer to the Red Army's quantitative superiority except nuclear weapons, an option everyone hoped never to use. Into this crisis stepped a new program, XM-1, later christened the M1 Abrams after the late General Creighton Abrams. The program's requirements, drafted in 1972 and refined through 1973, were uncompromising. The new tank had to be survivable, able to take hits and protect its crew. It had to be lethal, able to kill Soviet armor at long range with a high probability of a first-round hit. And crucially, it had to be mobile, fast enough to reposition rapidly on a fluid battlefield. But there was a fourth, less obvious requirement born from the Yom Kippur War's lessons. It had to see first. In modern combat, the side that detected the enemy first and fired first would win. Period. The solution the Army chose was radical and expensive: a passive thermal imaging sight. Unlike active infrared, which required projecting an invisible beam of light, thermal imaging detected the natural heat signatures of vehicles, humans, and terrain. It could see through darkness, smoke, fog, and, as it would turn out, sandstorms. The technology was cutting-edge, expensive, and unproven at scale. Two companies competed for the XM1 contract: Chrysler Defense and General Motors. Both prototypes had to meet the same specifications, but they took different approaches to the engine. GM opted for a diesel engine, conventional, reliable, fuel-efficient. Chrysler chose the Honeywell AGT 1500 gas turbine. Unorthodox, powerful, fuel-hungry. In 1976, after extensive testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the Army selected Chrysler's design, M1A1 Abrams, a history of the American main battle tank. The reasons were nuanced. The turbine offered superior acceleration and was quieter at idle, critical for ambush positions. Its multi-fuel capability meant it could run on diesel, kerosene, or jet fuel, simplifying logistics in theory. But most importantly, the Chrysler design integrated all the required systems: thermal sight, laser rangefinder, ballistic computer, and stabilized gun into a package that actually worked. Production was approved in 1979. The first M1 Abrams tanks rolled off the production line in Lima, Ohio in 1980. By 1984, the improved M1A1 variant entered service, featuring a license-built German 120mm smoothbore gun to replace the original 105mm weapon. But as these tanks entered service, Soviet intelligence was filing reports that confirmed their biases. The turbine engine was loud. The distinctive high-pitched whine could be heard for miles, ruining tactical surprise. Fuel consumption was indeed extraordinary. The M1 needed refueling after roughly 8 hours of operations compared to 1.4 Prof 65s for Soviet diesels. The thermal sights were rumored to be fragile and required extensive maintenance. What Soviet analysts failed to understand was that every one of these flaws was an acceptable trade-off for capabilities they couldn't yet imagine. The mockery was not confined to Moscow. Within the U.S. military, the M1 Abrams had plenty of critics. Abrams was sometimes sarcastically expanded to another big ripoff from Army morons. The fuel consumption was a genuine problem. During exercises in Germany, M1 units required dedicated fuel convoys that often struggled to keep pace with the tanks themselves. Some commanders worried the Abrams would be chained to its logistics tail, unable to exploit breakthroughs. The turbine engine was particularly controversial. Unlike a diesel, which could idle for hours burning minimal fuel, the turbine consumed fuel constantly, even at idle. Tank crews quickly learned to shut down their engines whenever possible, a practice that added thermal stress to components. Maintenance crews accustomed to conventional engines had to learn new procedures. Early reliability problems were real and widely reported. Critics also pointed to the tank's weight. At 60 tons, it was the heaviest tank in the U.S. inventory. It could not be transported by the C-141 Starlifter, the primary strategic airlifter, and even the C-5 Galaxy could only carry one. This made rapid deployment to distant theaters extraordinarily difficult. Some war planners questioned whether the Abrams could even reach a war in the Middle East in time to matter. But the harshest critics were abroad. Soviet military journals in the early 1980s published scathing assessments. One 1982 article in Voyannaya Missile, Military Thought, the classified Soviet General Staff Journal, described the M1 as a prestige program that sacrificed practical combat capability for technological showmanship. The article praised Soviet designers for avoiding the American disease of over-engineering.
Glance: Soviet military intelligence in war.
Iraqi officers, trained by Soviet advisors throughout the 1980s, absorbed these lessons. Iraq's Republican Guard, reorganized and re-equipped after the Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988, received extensive Soviet assistance. Iraqi tank crews were trained on Soviet doctrine, aggressive maneuver, fire and movement, and the assumption that their T-72s were qualitatively equal or superior to Western tanks of the same generation. During the 1980s, Iraq became one of the largest operators of Soviet military equipment outside the Warsaw Pact. By 1990, Iraq fielded approximately 2,500 to 3,000 T-72 tanks of the M and M1 export variants, Zaloga T-72 main battle tank. These were somewhat downgraded from Soviet domestic versions. lacking the latest composite armor inserts and fire control computers, but they were still formidable. Iraqi crews had combat experience from 8 years of grinding warfare against Iran. They were not novices. When Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait in August 1990, the tanks that rolled across the border included hundreds of T-72s. Saddam Hussein's regime was confident. American threats of military intervention were dismissed. Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world. It had chemical weapons, and it had defense in depth. As coalition forces began deploying to Saudi Arabia in Operation Desert Shield, the defensive buildup phase, Iraqi commanders studied their enemy. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Americans were bringing M1 Abrams tanks. The Iraqi assessment, filtered through Soviet doctrine and Soviet confidence, was that these tanks were theoretically potent but logistically fragile. In the open desert, far from pre-positioned supply bases, the Abrams fuel consumption would be crippling. Iraqi doctrine called for mobile defense, drawing the Americans into killing zones, then counterattacking from the flanks to hit supply lines. The plan seemed sound. What the Iraqis couldn't see, what nobody except a handful of American tank crews fully understood, was that the M1 Abrams had been designed to fight a numerically superior Soviet force in Central Europe. The Iraqi desert was not fundamentally different from the North German plain. The doctrine was not different. The T-72 was the same T-72, but the fight would be fundamentally different in one respect. It would be the first war where thermal imaging dictated the battlefield. Throughout late 1990 and early 1991, as coalition forces built up in Saudi Arabia, Iraqi commanders prepared defensive positions. They dug berms, earthen walls that could hide tanks hull down, exposing only the turret. They constructed kill zones with overlapping fields of fire. They mined approaches. They studied maps and rehearsed counter-battery fire plans. What they did not and could not rehearse was fighting an enemy they would never see. The storm that descended on February 26, 1991, seemed like a gift to Iraqi defenders. Visibility dropped to zero. No aircraft could fly. No attack could come. They were safe. They were wrong. The advantage the Soviets and Iraqis failed to understand was not a single system, but a trinity of technologies working in concert. The M1's thermal sight, its fire control computer, and its laminated composite armor. Each was revolutionary on its own. Together, they created a tank that fought in a different dimension than any opponent. Begin with the thermal sight. The system installed on the M1A1 was the AN/VSGT two-tank thermal sight built by Texas Instruments. It was a second-generation forward-looking infrared FLIR system, meaning it detected heat naturally emitted by objects rather than reflected light. The technology was rooted in aerospace applications. Satellites and reconnaissance aircraft had used similar systems for years, but adapting it to the brutal environment of a tank was a monumental engineering challenge. The sight worked by detecting infrared radiation in the 8.12 micron wavelength band. All objects with temperature above absolute zero emit infrared radiation, and the hotter they are, the more radiation they emit. A tank's engine, even hours after shutdown, emits significant heat. Exhaust ports glow brightly. Even the friction-warmed tracks of a vehicle that passed minutes ago show up as ghostly traces. The M1's thermal sight could detect a tank-sized heat signature at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters under ideal conditions. In practical combat conditions, accounting for terrain, weather, and target positioning, detection ranges were typically 2,000 to 2,500 meters. This sounds modest until you understand that Soviet and Iraqi night vision systems, based on active infrared technology, had effective ranges of 800 to 1,200 meters and required projecting an IR spotlight that could be detected by anyone with an IR-sensitive device, Zaloga, Armored Thunderbolt. More critically, thermal imaging worked in conditions that defeated all other sensors. Smoke had minimal effect. The heat signature passed through. Fog was transparent to infrared. Darkness was irrelevant. And, as Eagle Troop would discover, sandstorms, impenetrable walls to human vision, were nearly invisible to thermal sensors. The second element was the fire control system. The M1 system was not merely a targeting computer, It was an integrated suite that combined multiple sensors and calculated a firing solution automatically. The sequence was this. The gunner placed his crosshairs on a target in the thermal sight. He pressed the laser rangefinder button. An invisible infrared laser beam, pulsing at thousands of times per second, bounced off the target and returned. The system measured the time delay and calculated range with an accuracy of plus or minus 10 meters. This range, combined with data from other sensors, a muzzle reference system that measured minute bends in the gun barrel due to temperature, a crosswind sensor, the ammunition type, even air temperature and barrel wear, was fed into a ballistic computer. The computer calculated the precise gun elevation and lead angle needed to hit the target. This calculation occurred in milliseconds. The gunner saw a firing reticle in his sight. When the reticle settled on the target and a fire indicator illuminated, he squeezed the trigger. The first shot was, statistically, a hit. Compare this to Soviet fire control. In a T-72, the gunner used a stadiometric rangefinder, a manual optical device requiring the gunner to bracket the target's height against graduated marks and then consult a table to estimate range. Alternatively, some T-72 variants had laser rangefinders, but these fed into less sophisticated ballistic calculators. The gunner had to account for wind, temperature, and barrel droop manually or rely on preset approximations. Achieving a first-round hit at 2,000 meters required extensive training and some luck. The third element, often underestimated, was armor. The M1A1's frontal armor incorporated British-developed Chobham composite, a classified arrangement of steel, ceramic, and other materials in a layered matrix. The exact composition remains classified even today, but the principle is understood. When a shaped charge warhead detonates, it forms a superheated jet of metal traveling at several kilometers per second. This jet penetrates armor by hydrodynamic action, essentially flowing through the steel like a liquid at high pressure. Chobham's ceramic layers disrupted this jet, causing it to break apart, dissipate, and lose penetrative energy. Against kinetic penetrators, solid darts of tungsten or depleted uranium traveling at 1,500 to 1,700 meters per second, the ceramic layers were incredibly hard, shattering the tip of the penetrator and reducing its effective length. The composite arrangement meant that the effective protection was far greater than the physical thickness or weight would suggest. Soviet intelligence knew the M1 had special armor, but they consistently underestimated its effectiveness. GRU reports estimated the M1's frontal protection as equivalent to 550 mom of rolled homogeneous armor against shaped charges. The actual protection was likely 800 equivalent or higher, though exact figures remain classified. More importantly, Soviet APFSDS rounds, like the 3BM42 Mango, which could penetrate 500 millimeters at 2,000 meters, were marginal against the Abrams frontal armor at combat ranges. Zaloga T-72 main battle tank. Combine these three advantages and you had a tank that could detect an enemy before the enemy detected it, fire accurately at extreme range, and survive return fire if the enemy managed to shoot back. In tank combat, this combination was decisive. But there was a fourth advantage, less tangible but equally important: crew quality. The M1 Abrams was designed for a professional, all-volunteer force. U.S. tank crews in 1991 were products of years of intensive training. They had trained on advanced simulators. They had fired hundreds of training rounds. They understood not just how to operate their tank, but how to fight it. The U.S. Army's doctrine emphasized combined arms, tanks working with infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support in coordinated operations. Crews were trained to communicate constantly, share information, and adapt to changing situations. This was not a conscript army learning to drive tanks in 6 weeks. This was a professional force that had spent the 1980s preparing for exactly one war: a high-intensity armored conflict against Soviet-style forces. The Iraqis, for all their combat experience against Iran, had trained on Soviet doctrine designed for mass assault. Individual crew initiative was discouraged. Coordination between units was limited. Most critically, they had never faced an enemy with thermal sights. They had no concept of what it meant to fight a force that could see you when you were blind. The mystery that would haunt military analysts was this: how did Soviet and Iraqi intelligence fail to grasp the implications of the answer is that they knew about the systems but did not understand how they would change the fundamental nature of tank combat. They saw the thermal sight as an incremental improvement in night fighting capability. They did not grasp that it redefined night to include any condition with reduced visibility, including sandstorms. The stage was set. The Americans had built a tank designed to kill Soviet armor at long range in all weather. The Iraqis, trained on Soviet doctrine and equipped with Soviet tanks, had prepared for a battle fought at close range in good visibility. Neither side yet understood they were about to fight two completely different wars. The battle began without preamble. At 4:18 p.m. on February 26, 1991, Eagle Troop's lead tanks crested a slight rise in the desert, and Staff Sergeant Craig Koch, gunner in Captain McMaster's tank, calmly reported targets in his thermal sight. The range was 2,400 meters, nearly a mile and a half. In the swirling sandstorm, human visibility was perhaps 50 meters. Koch could see dozens of Iraqi vehicles as clearly as if they were parked in bright sunlight. The Iraqi positions belonged to the 18th Brigade of the Tawakalna Republican Guard Division. This was not a second-rate unit. The Tawakalna had been rebuilt after the Iran-Iraq War and equipped with T-Sistina, 72M tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and a full complement of artillery. They were dug in along a low ridge system, hauled down in defensive berms, exactly where Soviet doctrine said they should be. Their positioning was tactically sound. In a conventional engagement, one where both sides could see, this would have been a dangerous fight. But this was not a conventional engagement. Eagle Troop's M1A1s sat at the extreme edge of effective range for Iraqi guns, and the Iraqis couldn't see them at all. The first kill was textbook. Koch identified the target, a T-72 with only its turret visible above the berm. He lasted 2,420 meters. The fire control computer processed the solution. The firing reticle settled. On the way, Koch reported, and squeezed the trigger. An M1A1 depleted uranium penetrator weighing 10 pounds and traveling at 1,575 meters per second crossed the distance in roughly 1.8 seconds. It struck the T-72's turret just below the gun mantlet. The tungsten-depleted uranium dart punched through the turret front, through the crew compartment, and into the ammunition carousel in the hull. The tank exploded, its turret blown completely off the hull by the force of 22 rounds of ammunition detonating simultaneously. Burq Jayhawk, the 7 Corps in the Persian Gulf War. The Iraqi crew never knew they were under attack. No radar warning. No visual sighting. No sound of an approaching round over the howl of the wind. Just instant obliteration. Eagle Troop's other tanks engaged simultaneously. Lieutenant John Gifford's platoon on the northern flank, Staff Sergeant Jeffrey Taylor's platoon in the center. 9 M1A1s in a line, each acquiring targets, lasing, firing. The Iraqi positions erupted in a sequence of explosions. T-72s were destroyed in place. BMPs attempting to reposition were caught in the open and killed. A few Iraqi tanks managed to return fire, but they were shooting blind, traversing their turrets to pre-designated sectors and firing at estimated ranges. None of their rounds came close. The engagement developed into a running battle as Eagle Troop advanced. As Iraqi defenses collapsed under the onslaught, some vehicles attempted to flee. The thermal sights tracked them. Moving targets were simply a different calculation for the fire control computer. The M1A1's stabilized guns meant they could fire accurately on the move, a capability Iraqi tanks lacked. At one point, a T-72 managed to achieve a flank position roughly 1,000 meters from an M1A1. The Iraqi gunner fired. The round, likely a 3B M42 tungsten penetrator, struck the M1A1's frontal slope and shattered, the tungsten rod breaking apart against the composite armor. The impact rocked the tank, but penetration did not occur. The M1A1's crew, momentarily stunned, recovered and destroyed the T-72 with their return shot. Clancy armored Cav. This pattern repeated across the battlefield. In 23 minutes of combat, Eagle Troop destroyed approximately 37 T-72 tanks, 32 BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and numerous support vehicles. Total, 90 to 100 enemy vehicles destroyed. Not a single Eagle Troop vehicle was lost. Casualties, 0. this was not an anomaly. Across the Seven Corps front, similar engagements erupted as American armored units collided with Iraqi Republican Guard divisions. The 1st Armored Division's Iron Horse battalions engaged the Medina Republican Guard Division in battles that mirrored 73 Easting. Thermal sights acquiring targets through dust and smoke, long-range kills, Iraqi tanks destroyed before they could effectively respond. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment's engagements at 73 Easting became the most famous because they were well documented and because of the lopsided casualties. But they were representative. The pattern was universal. M1A1s detected Iraqi armor at 2,000 plus meters, achieved first-round kills, and advanced through positions before effective resistance could be organized. Statistics tell the story. During the 100 hours of ground operations in Desert Storm, coalition forces destroyed approximately 3,700 Iraqi tanks. Of these, roughly 2,000 were destroyed by M1 Abrams and British Challenger tanks. In return, coalition tank losses to enemy fire were minimal. Of 18 M1 Abrams damaged in combat, only 9 were permanent losses, and of those 9, not one was destroyed by enemy tank fire. The casualties were from mines, friendly fire, or other causes. Atkinson, Crusade, the untold story of the Persian Gulf War. The kill ratio was effectively infinity. Thousands of Iraqi tanks destroyed. 0 M1 Abrams lost to enemy tank fire. This was not just a victory, it was a revelation. The nightmare scenario Soviet planners had feared, that qualitative advantages could overcome quantitative superiority, had come to pass, and it had not even been close. The reports that reached Moscow in the spring of 1991 were not just military assessments, they were obituaries for Soviet armored doctrine and, in a very real sense, for the Soviet Union itself. The first detailed analyses came from Russian military observers who had been attached to Iraqi units or who debriefed Iraqi officers who escaped the fighting. Their reports were devastating. Iraqi tank crews described being destroyed without ever seeing their attackers. They described M1 Abrams tanks firing accurately at ranges where return fire was impossible. They described complete helplessness. One report, later circulated among Russian military analysts, included an interview with an Iraqi Republican Guard tank commander who survived 73 Easting. He described sitting in his T-72 during the Sandstorm, confident in his defensive position, when the tanks around him began exploding one by one. He never saw the American tanks. He fired his main gun in the direction he thought the enemy was located and saw his round disappear into the storm. Moments later, his tank was hit from a different direction. He and his driver escaped, but the rest of his crew was killed. He emphasized that the Americans never got close. He never saw them. This, he said, was not tank combat as he understood it. It was execution. Zaloga, Armored Thunderbolt. The technical implications were profound. Soviet analysts finally understood that the M1's thermal sights were not a minor enhancement, but a transformational advantage. The realization that thermal imaging worked in sandstorms, smoke, and fog meant that the entire basis of Soviet night fighting doctrine, active infrared illumination, was obsolete. Worse, it was a liability. An active infrared spotlight announced your position to any enemy with even basic thermal detection. The armor performance was equally shocking. Post-war analysis of destroyed T-72s showed that M1A1 depleted uranium penetrators had punched through frontal armor that Soviet doctrine claimed could resist equivalent threats. Conversely, Iraqi hits on M1 Abrams tanks, there were several documented cases, failed to penetrate. The Chobham composite armor had proven far more effective than GRU estimates. But the most disturbing realization was doctrinal. Soviet armored doctrine, refined over decades and tested in countless exercises, had assumed that tank combat occurred at ranges of 1,000 to 1,500 meters, where firepower and positioning were decisive. The M1 Abrams had demonstrated it could dominate at 2,000 to 2,500 meters, ranges where Soviet fire control systems were marginal at best. The entire concept of mass-armored assault, predicated on closing quickly to effective range and overwhelming the defender with numbers, fell apart if the defender could kill the attackers before they reached effective range. Soviet responses were attempted but half-hearted. Development accelerated on the T. 80U and T-90 tanks, incorporating better armor, improved fire control, and, critically, thermal sights. But the Soviet economy was collapsing. The USSR itself would dissolve in December 1991, just months after Desert Storm. The Russian Federation that emerged inherited Soviet military industries, but lacked the resources to field new equipment at scale. The broader lesson transcended tank design. Soviet military science had been built on certain assumptions: that Soviet equipment was qualitatively equal to Western equivalents, that superior numbers would compensate for any deficiencies, and that Soviet operational art, the skill in planning and executing large-scale operations, would prevail. Desert Storm shattered all three assumptions. The laughter from that 1978 briefing room in Moscow had returned as a haunting specter. The pig that would sink in mud had proven nimble. The Devo with the thirsty engine had maintained operational readiness rates exceeding 90% in the desert, far higher than Soviet diesels in comparable conditions. The brittle electronics had functioned flawlessly, and the paper tiger had revealed itself as something far more dangerous. There is a coda to this story. In the years after Desert Storm, Russian military analysts conducted detailed studies of what went wrong. Some blamed the quality of export Model T-72s provided to Iraq, arguing domestic Soviet versions would have performed better. This was partially true but missed the point. Others blamed Iraqi training and doctrine, which was fair but incomplete. The best Russian analyses acknowledged the fundamental issue. The Americans had integrated technologies, thermal sights, composite armor, advanced fire control, into a platform operated by highly trained crews, creating a synergistic advantage that Soviet doctrine had not anticipated. One Russian tank designer, in a candid interview published in the military journal Armata in 1997, put it this way: "We designed our tanks for the war we expected to fight, a massive, fast-moving conflict decided in days. The Americans designed their tank for the war that actually happened, a war of information dominance and long-range precision. We built a weapon for soldiers. They built a weapon for professionals." Quoted in Zaloga, T-72 main battle tank. The legacy of the M1 Abrams extends beyond its combat record. The tank remains in service today, more than 40 years after its introduction, continuously upgraded with better armor, sensors, and ammunition. It has fought in every major U.S. conflict since 1991. Iraq in 2003, the insurgency years, and training missions worldwide. Its basic design has proven remarkably adaptable. But the deeper legacy is conceptual. The Abrams represented a philosophy that investing in survivability, sensors, and crew capability could overcome numerical inferiority. This philosophy, quality over quantity, information dominance over mass, became the foundation of U.S. military doctrine in the post-Cold War era. The Soviets had looked at the chaos of Western military procurement, the arguments, the cost overruns, the competing contractors, and seen dysfunction. What they failed to see was that this apparent chaos was the engine of innovation. Competition forced designers to push boundaries. Debate forced rigorous testing. The messiness of democratic oversight, for all its frustrations, ultimately produced a system that worked. The Soviet system, by contrast, was efficient and focused but ultimately brittle. It excelled at producing adequate solutions quickly, but struggled with revolutionary innovation. The T-72 was a masterpiece of incremental improvement, a T-34 perfected for the modern era. The M1 Abrams was a revolutionary platform that redefined what a tank could be. The mystery of the Abrams was never really a mystery at all. It was a question Soviet analysts asked but couldn't answer because the answer contradicted everything they believed. They asked, how can a tank this expensive, this complex, this fuel-hungry, be effective? The answer was that effectiveness in modern war was not measured by simplicity it was measured by the ability to see first, shoot first, and survive to fight again. In the end, the laughter stopped not with a whimper but with a thunderclap. 90 Iraqi tanks destroyed in 23 minutes. 0 American losses. The joke had become a nightmare, and the nightmare had a name. Thermal sight superiority in a sandstorm they thought would protect them. The Battle of 73 Easting was not just a military victory. It was an answer to a decade of questions, delivered with absolute finality. The Dragon had emerged from the storm, and the world would never see tank warfare the same way again.